I want to dive a little bit deeper into your particular methodology. So GeoLift testing at a high level, there's a bunch of different ways to conduct this, right? There's a couple of publishers that have their own GeoLift testing capabilities, like Google has GeoX, but you can also even run this without any partner just by doing something in-house and saying, we're going to find these DMAs that are correlated. We're going to run increases in these specific areas and do this whole test design and then look at the results. I know one of the unique differentiators of what y'all do is the synthetic control method. I wonder at a high level if you can kind of explain, well, maybe actually before we get into the synthetic control method, what are some of the key challenges that you see with clients when starting up a GeoLift test? And how do you kind of approach that?
Right. So we have a few clients who kind of came to us after they tried this themselves, or at least designed a test themselves and wanted to kind of run things by us to make sure it was a good setup. The first thing is, of course, high quality data, right? So you need to make sure that you actually have that and that you collect it in the right way. So, for example, the basics of GeoLift testing, of course, is that you group users by location. So the question is, of course, okay, but what breakdown? Should it be zip codes? Should it be cities, DMAs, states? In the US, that's the way. We have internationally, it's even more complicated in some cases. So that is like one thing that you need to think about, and how that translates to the actual ad network you're going to run it on. So I think it sounds simple, but when you actually get down to it, it is a little bit trickier than you maybe first think.
One of the things that we kind of struggled with, and I'll give some context. So I've conducted a number of GeoLift tests. One way to do this is to look at certain conversion volume and to try to find DMAs that are correlated with each other, that move in similar ways, which we've done. And then what we did was we said, okay, DMA A showed this lift quarter over quarter. DMA B showed this lift. DMA C, the control group, showed this lift. What was the difference between those two? And then compare the difference between target and control to get a lift number. Simple enough, right? What that ignores, though, it ignores a couple things, but one of the main challenges for me is, how do you pick the right DMAs? So, for example, what we did, we conducted a more sophisticated analysis this year or this quarter, and it's harder to do because you don't have DMA level spend in all of your channels and things like that, right? And like with iOS, with app network channels, it's harder to get. But what we did is we tried to get to a CAC by DMA. Advertisers could look at a ROAS DMA or whatever, some sort of KPI. And then what we're saying is, let's pick the DMAs that have the best performance. Like, I don't want to increase in New York if my CAC is really high there. I'd rather pick this other DMA to test in. How do you think about incorporating not only like performance data into a GeoLift test to know that you're targeting the right DMAs, but then also to make sure that those DMAs are correlated and that you're going to have, good test design?
Right. So, at Twigeo, we built our own kind of engine or solution. So what we do is that we take the client's data by console conversion data, if that installs, revenue, whatever, by location, and look at exactly what you say. We look at correlations. We run that through our kind of machine learning engine to look at correlations, to make sure that the two kind of groups are the same, right? So is New York and LA similar to a combination of, I don't know, Chicago, Washington, or Miami, right? So that's like step one. And when we create these correlations, we obviously need to make sure that they are stable over time. So what we do is that we do cross-validation to make sure that it's not just a fluke that these places are correlated, but we can actually predict that they will behave the same in the future on unseen data. So that's more the math part of it, I guess. Then we also look at kind of what you alluded to. We also need to go into the ad networks when we can to make sure that has Meta, for example, actually spent money in these places where we want to spend money, because otherwise, if we do these exclusions and we don't spend there, it's useless to run the test. So we need to make sure that Meta previously has seen at least some type of efficiency in these kind of areas.
Sure. And what are your thoughts on decisioning on DMAs based on not only what Meta is doing, but like holistically what performance looks like in a given DMA, and then also what market penetration looks like in a DMA? Because that's a big thing as well. We talk about diminishing returns, right? And maybe that's part of the correlation, but like, maybe New York and Austin move together, but New York, we've already spent a lot of money and we're at a high volume and we're close to diminishing returns. And Austin's a smaller DMA that we haven't spent as much in. How do you account for that?
I would usually say that we do not account for that too much. To be honest, what we do is that we want a big enough number of DMAs to make sure that it is not as impactful if that happens. It is a factor, and usually what we do is we trust the data to show these things. Like it will tell us if they're correlated or not over a long period of time. Of course, what we do is that when we run these test designs, we get a lot of different options that has the best statistical probability of being a good test. We obviously run this by our marketing team and the client's marketing team, and it's very common that these very big areas like New York, LA, clients usually have opinions about those. So in some cases we exclude them, or in some cases we force them to be included in the test. So it's a lot of more, I guess, marketing intuition that is combined with the data.
How do you think about running a targeted geo test where you are saying, I'm going to spend incremental budget in this area versus we want to reduce? And I'll give you a specific example, right? Many brands have a media mix where they have a certain amount of budget allocated towards experimental channels, new tests, things like that, which I think you can run GeoLift and you can say, I want to increase, and this is how we're going to do that. But then there's also the level of, we know we have to reduce X amount this quarter, right? For seasonal brands, they might, spend a lot in Q4, but then they have to cut down in Q1. How do you think about applying GeoLift to that? Do you do a lot of exclusion tests where, for example, we know that Q1 is going to be slower, so we're going to exclude some DMAs in paid search while also reducing and get a sense of incrementality that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is, I would say maybe a third of our tests are like that. And it's very common when we do that, what you said in seasonality, but usually when we want to test kind of their core channels. So let's say Meta is their biggest channel. It's very dangerous for them as a business to exclude half of the areas to target. I mean, the leadership will say, no way, we can't risk that business impact, right? So that's how we started doing this, what we call inverse tests. So instead of launching something in places, you exclude marketing in a few areas. And the good thing with that is that you only need to do that you can exclude a smaller audience. So usually if you do a classic GeoLift study, maybe you need to run in, let's say, 60%, run nothing in 40%. With this inverse approach, we've been able to get that down to 10%. So you basically run in 90% of the US and you only pause in 10%. So it's been very popular.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. What our approach has been more like, we have national, and then when we're doing these GeoLift tests, we'll pick, out of the 200 DMAs, we'll pick 4 to 5, and maybe we'll pick one DMA per. The DMA tests or the lift tests that you're doing, I guess they're a little bit more broader. Like they're kind of either splitting your spend by 50% or more. Is that what that looks like?
If we do a classic one, yes, for sure. It's easier to get a good test, just statistically, if you have a more balanced kind of test and control group, because you have more places to choose from, right? When you create these synthetic control groups. But of course, we need to actually take into consideration that it's marketing we're doing, we're impacting the business. So it's always a business versus science question there.
Sure. Okay. So the idea is essentially like the larger, the broader the location that you're targeting or excluding, the less there is these small variances of we might be better in this DMA versus that DMA, or this city versus that city. You're trying to, I guess, even out, balance out that stuff.
Exactly. For example, like we have a classic, let's say we do in the US, we have DMAs. I think it's around 200 DMAs in the US. So it's going to be so much easier for our kind of method to find a good test and control group if they have, let's say, 100 DMAs to choose from. So what a synthetic control group is that all of these 100 control DMAs are included in the holdouts, but they have different weightings, which are based on this cross validation, et cetera. So it's just a fancy Bayesian machine learning or regression analysis that just creates a model out of all of these DMAs, and we weight them based on creating the best model, basically. And
the data that's going into that is basically like a brand's own conversion, like unattributed data.
Correct. The whole, the total, to see how conversion behavior looks like across different places.
Sure. I think that can be contrasted with what we're kind of looking at, which I think is interesting for advertisers to think about, because some of the things we're thinking about is like, how do we spend enough in a given DMA to get the results that we want, right? Like, what is the impression volume, or what is the frequency that we have to hit in a given DMA to get lift? But do you have any perspective on like that more micro kind of testing,
When we design the test, we are kind of our machine learning algorithm strategy. It gives us like, this is the minimum budget and you need to spend based on estimates of your, say, let's say return on ad spend or cost per install, or whatever the metric would be, and that is based on how stable your data is. So if let's say we have a perfect model where New York and LA is perfectly modeled by some other states, that means that you can spend very little money to actually see the incrementality. Whereas if you have more noisy data, then you will need to spend more to get a good read on the true incrementality.